Welcome back to Dev Dive episode 29. I'm your host, Nighthawk. Today we're jumping into the world of game dev with my guest, Jared Sartin, a front-end developer for the Cryptic Studios. Thanks for coming on the show, Jared.
Yeah, not a problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So funny story about how we got in contact with Jared for the show. I put out a Reddit post about a week or two ago, sort of extolling the virtues of my show. I'm like, hey, I thought this was really cool. We had a bunch of people on the show. This might be useful for people in the world of game dev or people trying to get into game dev. And it got some pretty popular attention on the front page of Reddit. So one of the top comments was like, hey, I really dig this, but almost all of your game dev guests are from Riot Games. Can you get anyone else on? I'm like, well, right now it's kind of hard to get people on the show if I don't know who they are. But if you know anyone who wants to come on, please let me know. And we actually had a ton of people reach out and offer to be on the show, and Jared was one of them. So thank you so much for reaching out.
Yeah, I think I was actually one of the quote unquote trolls. These are all Riot developers. Where's the rest of them? I
Where's
think that
the
was
real
kind of
game
our.
devs?
Where are the other ones? Yeah.
Yeah, so very excited to have a talk with you today about everything. So I think one of the first things to talk about is your first role, your current role at Cryptic, and then we'll go into more depth on that later. So tell us about what a front end developer actually does, and like what sort of impact it's having on somebody playing the game, somebody like me.
So I just started at Cryptic a couple months back, actually late summer last year, somewhere in the midst of whatever 2020 was. And the front end team that I'm on is a handful of us, and in normal applications in web whatnot, the front end team is usually the crew that puts the buttons and text and information on screen. The the guy that you point the finger at, because they're usually the ones that leave the bugs first. In games, it's a little different because there's so much that builds into a game. Front end teams in games tend to be the UI engineers. So when you click a button, or when you see your health, or when you're fighting a mob and you see like the little explosion of damage pop off, and then you see like the gold like critical hit. Those are some of the things that like a front end engineer or a UI guy like myself would do. UI person, I should say. But it's really just kind of the how do we make the visuals of the game show the data? How do we manage your inventory? How do we give you messages? So I touch all of those aspects that aren't specifically gameplay.
Definitely. And I think in very, very basic terms, you're the person who takes the numbers and puts them into pretty pictures for people to actually understand what's going on.
Yeah, I'm the guy who puts the outlines on your numbers so you can read them on screen.
So switching topics to get a little bit more background on you, you mentioned in our precinct that you're actually a dungeon master for a D&D show on Twitch. What's that like?
Yeah, so for those of you watching on Twitch, you'll see behind me that there's some stuff hung up on my wall. Yeah, that's the backgrounds for my D&D show. It's actually a pretty cool experience. I've been playing D&D for 5+ years off and on, and then sporadically in the last 20. So in the last 20, I'd play a game here or there. But in the last 5 years, I've been playing a time or two a month. That kind of opened up some possibilities that as a software developer you don't always get. I'm a super creative software developer, so I love the world of possibilities and telling stories, and D&D is a place to do that. So we're like, why not just put together a show? If we get 2 people that watch, whatever, we can stream our campaigns, we can go back and look at them. I'm also a data collector, so I've got all of my episodes except for like the second episode that had a really funny Twitch glitch and we lost the VOD. So I've got all that. That it's really cool because when you're in the world of so many bits and pieces that are moving in like a D&D game or in software, being able to look back and go, oh yeah, that really did happen all those hundreds of hours ago is just a really cool experience to storytelling.
Yeah, I definitely value that a lot. One of the main benefits of doing a show like this is being able to go back 2 or 3 years whenever we first started doing this and looking back and saying like, oh wow, we made this much growth since then. Because in your brain plays tricks on you, and it doesn't really allow you to see that growth if you're just thinking back. You will think back and you'll be like, oh, I was exactly the same way back then. But having hard evidence going back and saying like, oh, we made a big difference between then and now. It feels very good.
Yeah. Having hard evidence of storytelling, having hard evidence of just even, the tech guy, which was myself, not being able to set up the microphone in the right direction in episode 3 or whatever it was.
So other than being able to look back and see the past differences, what are the main differences between DMing a private group of friends and DMing on a show like this?
Yeah, so I think one of the things here is this is live on Twitch right now, and you get to read some comments and interact with those. Um, and you don't tend to get that while you're playing D&D just at a table.
Mhm.
So sometimes chat, while they're only 20 or 40 seconds behind, throws something in that catches my players. All the players are able to read comments and respond to them. So we try and incorporate some of our fans. And we have a few regulars that come back time and time again. So they make little guest appearances as NPCs or various other things that, become a broader joke than four of us sitting at a table. So not only do you get like the interaction there, but you get things like um, being able to share those moments more broadly in a tweet or in a group on Discord. And it kind of opens up the world. Whereas sitting at a table in standard D&D with your friends, closed in a room, um, that world only lives there.
Mhm.
Whereas when people are watching, they can make fan art or side stories or say, "Oh, what about?" And so the world opens up possibilities to hundreds of people versus five.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. I love
Yeah.
the idea of bringing in user interaction into a game like D&D and just having some sort of ability for people who aren't maybe directly involved in the campaign to have some sort of impact on it. That makes a lot
Yeah,
of
I
sense.
mean, yeah, we have some tipping tiers that at a certain level of tipping, NPCs just show up in the game. So I have a friend or foe tier that will show like a dragon could just drop in and scorch the party as they're having breakfast, or a friend could show up for the rest of the episode. So it's fun because then the people watching feel like they can influence it in some way.
I have a friend group who is super interested in the D&D show Critical Role. Do they do anything like that, or are they more of a self-contained apparatus?
Critical Role took a interesting spin. I think early on they attempted to engage with chat, but it gets tough. They have, I
Mhm.
think, 6 to 8 players at a time, which is a huge group for D&D. So Matt Mercer is a brilliant dude, great with his voices and great with story, but to manage 6 to 8 people plus chat plus whatever it may be, even with someone strategically picking out a comment or two,
Yeah.
it's just so much going on in your head. But I think they operate a bit more closed, and then um, chat goes wild with their moderators, and they're able to have discussion with people who aren't directly influencing the game.
Yeah. So for anyone interested in your show, where would they find
Yeah.
that, and what time do you play?
Yeah, we play twice a month, usually the first and third Saturdays. Sometimes when there's a fifth Saturday of the month, which is this month,
Mm.
we play at 4 p.m. Pacific on Twitch. Here Be Dragons DND. HereBeDragonsDND.com has all of our links. We also pop into podcast format. Anchor FM is a wonderful tool that lets us get on all of the platforms, and we're like, why not? So you can catch us there if you don't see us live. I know we have people all across the globe that tune in. So if it's 2 a.m. when we start, go to bed. Catch us later.
Anchor FM is a godsend for somebody trying to host a podcast. I didn't when I first was looking and doing into research into doing a show like this. Um, there was like 3 sites that I saw, and one of them was paid, and I was like, okay, I'm making negative money on this already. I really don't want to put more negative money into it. And the other 2 were kind of crappy. And I was doing some more research, and I found Anchor FM, and I'm like, this is too good to be true. This is literally the easiest thing ever. You just upload the show, it goes out automatically to every site. You're done. That's it. There's a little bit of setup, but other than
Yeah,
that, it's magical.
you don't have to deal with the metadata and the tagging and the image uploads every spot you go.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
RSS feeds. Oh man, that's just a little aside. I love Anchor FM. I'm glad you mentioned them. I don't think they. I know that they do that weird advertisement stuff. I haven't messed around with that much yet, but Anchor FM, if you're
no,
out there, we'd love to have you as a sponsor on the show. I have nothing but great things to say about you. So moving on to some other topics about you, um, I thought this was really funny when I asked you for background talking points on yourself. You mentioned that you were a regional champion for a Counter Strike league, and I don't know how long ago was that.
Prefer not to answer that question. No, it was early 2000s. So back when Cal and CPL were the big ones, and then MLG came onto the scene. Back before any of these other like major events that you see. Now every esport has, or every game has their own esport league. It was a league, I think, for Halo, Counter Strike, and I want to say something like NBA, one of the NBA games of that time.
Mhm.
So I think it was early thousands. It was a handful of us that went to high school together. We were competing in Halo tournaments for fun, playing CS 1.6 for fun, um, and it was quite a fantastical experience to be playing these games competitively instead of just like I'm gonna hop
Mhm.
into a pickup server. It was more of a I'm gonna hop in, really enjoy, and see how I can uh, kind of make my way in this. One of the fun experiences I had around that time was we had entered into a competition locally, and we tried figuring out where it was. It was in the basement, in like a back corner of this car show. One of the booths was like, we're going to put together a few of the local teams and have them compete. It was like, what are we doing here? And like the grand prize for that was a $50 Burger King gift card.
Hell
So
yeah!
back in the heyday of esports.
So for people who were inside the CS:GO scene, or sorry, not CS:GO, back then it would be just Counter Strike. Um,
1.6.
1.6.
Oh no,
Um,
1.5 then.
how big a deal was Cal? Was Cal like the bee's knees for the competitive scene?
Yeah, Cal and CPL were, I think, if you look at it like in a sports setup, it would be like the minor leagues.
Mhm.
And then MLG was like the big leagues. Cal was the cyber amateur league or cyber athlete amateur league, and then CPL was like the step up, which was the cyber professional or cyber athlete professional league. So we were only in Cal. We weren't in like CPL where it was the big boys playing. But it was still kind of a fun thing because it was still you're one of the better teams in the game.
Definitely. So
Yeah.
did that riding the high of being the regional champion for Counter Strike? Did you ever consider like going professional, going competitive for a living?
At that time, it was not something as easily attainable. You
Mhm.
had to have sponsorship, you had to have an in, and it was a lot smaller pool of teams. So to go pro, you had to have been noticed and picked up, and usually that's what like Cal and CPL were set up for, is getting noticed, getting those sponsors, getting pulled up into the bigger leagues, getting transitioned over to MLG. Today, it's a lot easier because you can just stream it and someone goes, wow, you're good, I want you on my team. So I mean I probably briefly considered it and then went, nah.
Do you still play Counter Strike at all?
Once in a while I'll pop into 1.6 or CSGO. I moved on to Overwatch for a handful of years, and some StarCraft and StarCraft 2 were in the mix, so kind of all over the board for this kind of thing.
Yeah. StarCraft is a good game. We talk about StarCraft
Yeah.
more than probably is representative of people who still play StarCraft.
Yeah, I think it's got a nice place in most game developer and game people's hearts because it's something that kind of changed the genre and like stuck. It was a center point for a handful of years.
Yeah, I definitely enjoy playing it. Even though I wasn't one of the people who got into it like at a young age, I came into it probably 2009, right before StarCraft 2 launched. So I
Nice.
rode the second wave.
Hey, that was
Um,
a good wave to ride.
yeah, I grew up with Red Alert and Age of Empires. Those were my RTSs growing up. I think that's slightly after the original StarCraft boom.
Yeah, just a little bit.
So outside of gaming and outside of
Yep.
D&D, do you have any other interests and hobbies that you want to talk about?
I'm just a boring person. No, being a developer, I think I've always had little side projects. I've always been in game jams, trying new tools, new languages, various other things out. Um, that's kind of been like one of my go-tos. for a while, I was bicycling wherever I could throughout LA,
Mhm.
because in LA traffic is terrible. So you can walk, drive, or bike to the same place in about the same time, regardless if it's a mile or 3 miles away. So I got into cycling for a bit. We have a couple dogs, so two miniature dachshunds. Hopefully, they're going to stay quiet during this because they're little noisemakers. So just all around, trying getting away from screens is a big thing.
Yeah.
Being a software developer and a gamer, I'm staring at these pixels more often than not. So, being outside when it's not cold and rainy is a huge fun time for me.
Yeah, last year, before things shut down, I lived in LA, out of shoot, how did I already forget this? Hermosa Beach, or sorry,
Oh yeah,
the uh, the one right next to Hermosa Beach on the right, Redondo Beach. I should know this
Redondo,
because I
yeah,
lived there, and I worked in El Segundo, and
nice.
I didn't have a car, so I was like, "How am I going to get to El Segundo?" So the prevailing strategy ended up being bicycling. So I biked about 9 to 10 miles a day to get to the office, and it wasn't too bad. Everyone was sort of giving me all these scare tactics that like biking in LA was going to be a life threatening thing every time, but I think I avoided some of the worst areas in terms of traffic, luckily. But it was
I,
fun.
I
I
was
enjoyed
only
it.
I was only hit twice, so you know. Yeah, I was actually in Marina Del Rey and biked to the other side of Culver City, so it was 6, 7 miles one way, which was fun. When we get into past roles, it was at a game company, so a 3 a.m. bike home was definitely exhausting.
That's what my role had me getting off at around 12 o'clock at night, and biking home at on Aviation Boulevard, which is one of the bigger roads in El Segundo. It was awesome because there's nobody there. You get like one car, and it's sort of surreal because biking there, it's the height of rush hour. It's literally bumper to bumper traffic the whole way. So it was really odd coming back and being like completely deserted. It's just a different city at night.
Yeah,
Um, but Marina Del Rey is beautiful. I biked up there a couple times. It's just an absolutely gorgeous place to bike around.
yeah. I mean, it's great for walking and biking, and that's why we lived there for a while because who needed a car in LA if it was just going to stay parked most of the time?
Yeah, seriously. And then you're gonna get street sweeper tickets and everything. Man, I only lived there for like 10 months, and I'm already bitter about it. Okay, so let's talk about a bit about your degree in game development because the primary purpose of the show is to sort of give people a window into game dev and how to get into game dev. So the
Yeah.
place that most people start is college. So let's talk about both your degrees because you have two and why you decided to get them.
Yeah, surprise, I don't have a degree in game development. Back when I was in school, it was actually mildly rare to have that option at most colleges and universities. I think when I was looking to go to school, I was looking at either, I think, Phoenix University or DigiPen, two schools that really only had some of the higher caliber game development. I settled on not going to either because they were expensive and hard to get into. And so I decided I would take up network engineering and security, which after the first semester I said, no, not for me. And then I ended up pursuing a dual degree or a dual major in web design and web development because that's where I was at. I was building web pages. I was on the side, um, helping out mom and pop shops get online. Building people their Zanga and MySpace layouts, all the fun stuff of that era. And so I decided to kind of pursue it professionally, which is great because the school I went to is actually a more business and technology focused. So it was like business first, technology second. And I'm super thankful on that because as a technologist, I am innately learning and growing and building myself up anyways. And I don't think about the business side of it so
Yeah.
much. But when you're forced to go through all the business courses and project planning and Gantt charting and all of that mess, you go, oh yeah, there's a lot more to writing software, building a game than just hammering hands on keyboard and clicking away on pixels. So I decided to pursue the dual major because I figured if I'm not gonna get into games right away, I'll at least get into something that I'm able to do. That put me into like tracks of learning JavaScript and HTML and CSS, like the core tenets of what makes a web page. And then learning some of the back end technologies, which would be like C Sharp, C++, PHP, all the other single and triple letter programming languages that are kind of driving the internet these days. Um, so I got through that degree, and once I got through school, I realized and looked back actually just recently, uh, when I was able to choose any of the type of project, when it was like, hey, it's an open-ended assignment, make a final project in what you learned. I was always building games, like really messing with the tech that I had learned, and said, let's build a game out of this. It shouldn't work, but let's do it anyways. And that's kind of what pushed me at that point to say, well, eventually I'll get into games more permanently.
Hmm. I love that you mentioned the networking class because I took a couple networking classes myself, and I remember one of the assignments was to manually subnet out a bunch of IPs, um, and I just that was the moment where I'm like, okay, this isn't for me. I don't want to be calculating which are the ideal APs for IPv4 and IPv6, and it was just a mess.
Yeah, I
Um,
think the pivotal point for me was in my intro to network security. We were learning all of like the cheap ways to hack a system and then how to prevent it.
mhm,
And I ended up halfway through the semester going in and capturing like the login for the Blackboard, the software running the class,
mhm.
logging in and changing my grade to 120%, and then telling the professor that I did that. And it's like, I don't really want to do this if I'm breaking into the software that should be secure running this course, and then I don't want to deal with other like brats like myself doing that. So this isn't the role for me.
Yeah, it's a nuclear arms race of just like people getting ridiculously advanced at this sort of thing, and I was fully aware that my drive and knowledge was not going to be up to the snuff of some of these other people who were just really really smart and really really good at what they do. So
Yeah.
that cemented my career path outside of that. Um, So actually, this is interesting because, like we said earlier, we do have a lot of people on the show from Riot, and I think they have a bit of a different philosophy than maybe other game developers. So I wanted to ask you this. A lot of the people I talk to don't actually put a lot of weight into their college degrees. They went to college for something completely unrelated, or they didn't really learn anything, or they didn't really enjoy it. But you actually seem like you enjoyed and were thankful for your time at college. So how do you think that your education prepared you for your professional life?
Yeah, so kind of like what I said before, I don't think my degree was the thing I enjoyed and was excited about, but the secondary and tertiary courses that were alongside of that. Um, I was ready to just hop into a job right out of high school and do like website design and development for, like I said, mom and pop shops. That's what I was doing on the side. But I think going through school, it did a few things. One, it kind of matured me, stuck me in a spot for a little bit where I had space to experiment. I also had safety net kind of to experiment because while yes, you don't make a lot of money in college, you're also at that age and that point where you could have a side job such as waiting tables, which is what I did, that pays for your books, pays for your housing and whatnot. But then somehow you still end up having 20 hours a week to sink into a game like World of Warcraft. If you just harness that a little bit and put that to other studies, that's awesome. But like I was saying, is it wasn't the courses for my major that were the best. It was the courses that weren't. So business and law and project planning and various other things where it was like it gets my toes in the water for other parts of being a competent business person, really pushed me along, because then when I get into situations where an incredibly bright developer might stumble because they just don't know standard practice in business or project planning or various other things right out of school, I was able to have that like foot ahead where it's like, yeah, sure, I might not be able to answer all the programming questions to the CS 101 setup, but I can keep my project on task and know how to handle when it goes off tack. Um, I I also love saying this too. I worked with a guy in software development who studied to be a librarian and decided the instant he graduated that wasn't for him. And he was one of the brightest software developers in the company I was with at the time. It doesn't really matter per se about the degree in software or game development, as long as you've kind of furthered yourself and got your mind into like a growth pattern.
So if you were to start over today and you're going back to college or you're going to
Yeah.
college for the first time, what what would you do in order to get into a role like you are right now?
I think one of the things that I would do is, since I was in a web focused career path for school, that put me into an interesting spot. I didn't get the CS, the computer science side of it, meaning I didn't get all of the crappy little bits of information that everyone asks on the interviews. Like, can you write me a sort algorithm and can you do it backwards? And it's like, well, yes, but it won't be as efficient as someone who had the book hammered into them. So I'd make sure that's on my repertoire coming out of school. While I've taught myself most of that, I think it's a core competency because while you might go, oh yeah, I learned it in CS 101, I'm never going to use it again. Well, when you're sorting through data at a high rate of speed to get your game running faster, it does help. Uh, so that's one thing. Make sure you get your CS major in place. So this is from a developer standpoint. I know you've had a few other people of different calibers and backgrounds, but for a developer, I'd say get CS. Computer science is like your foundation. Take business courses, take project planning courses, take law, take whatever you can that would help you in business, because even if you're the smartest developer on the team, when it comes down to the extracurriculars and the other things that happen, um, when the project goes off the rails a little bit, and especially in game teams when things get really hectic and busy and maybe your producer just can't keep it all together, that's where you can step in and own bits and pieces of the project. That's where you can actually push yourself forward in the company, in the project, own something in a game that you might not have been able to before, just by having outside knowledge other than this is what I do and this is how I do it and this is what I do well. Know some other stuff. Jack of all trades is great, but be careful not to spread yourself too thin and be like, I can do audio design and 3D and CAD and levels design and systems design, but I can't do any of it well. So focus on like the core direction that you want to go. So for me, it'd be programming. I might throw in some like graphics systems where you do the fun 3D math, fun in air quotes, I should say, because 3D math is something that I once in a while wake up to in the middle of the night having nightmares of not being able to figure out what the quaternion is for a certain rotation, and that's just the mental hell some of us developers live in.
So on the less technical side of thing for
Mhm.
college, do you have any recommendations or ideas for people to stay, like you said, stay sane in college and make it the best experience for them? Maybe not in terms of classes, but hobbies
Yeah.
and what to do outside of that.
Yeah, I think one of the big things is keeping your mind engaged, but not overwhelming it. I think in school, there's a lot of overwhelming because you just get so much information thrown at you all the time. Uh, Not letting your mind shut off. I think in my first semester or two, I sunk so much time into World of Warcraft, so I just kind of like click that off. And so it was these hard starts and stops that I was having with like the mental focus, which made it challenging in some of the courses. So don't turn off per se. One thing I found here, and they're always sitting off to the side, is I've got a handful of Rubik's cubes here, and I'm not a great Rubik's cuber, but it's something where it's like it engages your mind, but not to an extent that you're sitting there trying to solve some rocket science program, but instead maybe you can get a little further this time. And it's very methodical, so it does keep your mind engaged. So find something that's like engaging but not overwhelming as like a little hobby or a project, something you can sit down to for 5 or 10 minutes. Um, that just kind of keeps the juices flowing. I think also surround yourself with others that maybe aren't in your level or even in your degree, because you'll learn stuff. You'll learn things from other majors. You'll learn things from people who are ahead or even behind you in school. And I think that's one of the things that people forget is they surround themselves with the group partners and the project partners, but they don't go talk to the business person or to the nursing students down the hall. Who knows? You might get onto a game later that is like Surgeon Simulator, and you need to know the difference between a spleen and a kidney. So you might find that out.
I like that. And I like the point that you made about not letting your brain shut down, because I think that I definitely fell into that trap when I was in college. I fell into the just all encompassing. It wasn't WoW for me. It was probably League of Legends, honestly. But um, just letting yourself get trapped in that thing and letting it become the most important thing in your life, even though it shouldn't be, and it shouldn't even be in the top three. Because it's dangerous. It's so easy. I don't even want to say it's escapism, because it is sort of filtering your brain into like something that is important to you, but it's definitely not the most constructive thing you could be doing with your time, especially in college.
Yeah, I mean, it is a drug in terms that the chemicals your brain produces. It's addicting, and I'm sure we all fall into it. But I think the big thing too is while that's addicting and that's something that like you keep your hand-eye coordination up, it's great for that. It's great to get a little bit of that in. It's also great to go for a run or pick up some weights once in a while. That's another thing too is keeping the blood flowing. Because the more that you keep like your body in motion, the easier it is for your brain to get rid of the distractions. And usually, for most people, the easier it is to focus, to sleep, to continue to metabolize, which is all great for learning. And a lot of times, you're just like, nah, I'm done with school. I'm just gonna go sit in front of Netflix for 6 hours and check out, which doesn't help.
Yeah. Never underestimate the power of lifting for 5 minutes, or doing some push-ups, or jumping jacks, or running down the road, or just get some physical exercise in. I know it's like the oldest trope in the book, and it's everybody gives this advice, but you never understand how important it is until you're actually going out and doing it. And you're just like, it just refreshes your brain for a second. You're like, okay, this isn't the worst time of my life. I'm not having the worst day ever. I'm able to focus and work on this project before it's due the night before because I procrastinated too much.
The life of
Um,
any college student, right?
it's easy to become trapped in your room, your dorm, your apartment, wherever you are, and sort of just become disconnected from everything. So if you can go outside and walk down the road and see some nature, it helps a lot. But yeah,
Yeah.
just don't
I mean,
don't check out.
don't check out. I mean, the thing there too is like staying refreshed keeps you from getting those feelings of, oh man, I won't be able to get into this career, or I won't be able to finish my degree, which I think is a big thing when it comes to game development, because it is mildly challenging to break in. Game development as a whole, we're not a huge group of people. I'm sure I'm gonna cross paths with six of the guys that I worked with in the last 10 years in the next five or six. Like, I will see the same people again and again, and so getting into it is a challenge. And I'm not saying you can't, but I'm just saying like it sucks when you're sitting there all alone and checked out, going, I won't be able to. You can. You just need to
Yeah.
get yourself over that hump.
Yeah, understand the path that you need to take to get into it, because it might not be as direct as you think it is, which is an excellent
Never.
segue into the next part of this conversation. Let's talk about your roles before you joined Cryptark. So
Yeah.
there was a lot of them when I looked up your LinkedIn. I'm like, oh man, this guy's done a lot of different stuff. So let's talk briefly about everything from college to Cryptic. I think I called it
Yeah.
Cryptark
So
earlier. Cryptic.
yeah, all good. Yeah, so Cryptic Studios is where I'm at, but as you said, the pathway there is a long and interesting one. I'm gonna try and go from memory, and forgive me if I miss. I'll backtrack. I'll get to it. But right out of school, I had gone to work at a company called Armstrong International, uh, steam, air, and hot water processing facility. Like they created the little pieces that go into big processing plants. So the can of soda that you might be drinking now or will drink later goes through a lot of processes, such as spraying down the metal as it comes in a sheet, getting it to the right temperature, spraying it down as they fill it so it doesn't explode all over. That company made like all the little bits and pieces that go into making sure that temperature or that spray or that flow is great. Now, the reason I expounded on that is because I ended up rebuilding their entire product catalog website, which was a very fun experience in PHP. I don't want to get into any depth of that, but it was essentially moving from one system to a newer version of that system that didn't match. Um, so it was a great learning experience there. It was one where I got to deal with a lot of data. I got hired in on the marketing team as the developer, which later I found out was because the marketing team wasn't getting the development team's support, but they had budget for another person. So that was kind of fun because that let me hit points where, not to throw the company under the bus at all, but that let me hit points where I was able to bridge a team that knew nothing about development with a team who knew a lot about development, and that's where I was able to immediately start applying my degree, in terms of not the degree but the other courses. So knowing what the business goals were and knowing what the outcomes were, I was able to talk between the teams and get things aligned and kind of liaise, which is incredible and scary all at the same time, as like a 21-year-old trying to rebuild millions of nodes of data and making sure they're correct when we build a new website, because there's people all over the globe needing their readmes for these things. So that was fairly interesting. I'll
How
pause
large
here
was
for a second.
Armstrong? Do you know?
So I was in a little town called Three Rivers. I think the town was about a half block long. So the building itself, there were a handful of people on like sales and marketing, probably about 10 or 12 of us on that floor. We had a whole machine shop and CAD agency and design. We had a network of sales reps and people across the US. So I think in building, we only had about 100 to 200 people, and that was including the majority of the staff being on like the design and machinery floor.
Mhm.
And then we probably had about 50 or 100 throughout the US and the rest of the world who helped sell and market the product.
So coming in, would you say that you were like one of the only people who really knew what they were doing in terms of like computer design and website design?
Nope. We actually had a development team that was building some of the applications for like the embedded firmware for these boxes. So you can't just sell a nozzle and say it'll work in any system. You write code around how
Mhm.
that nozzle opens and closes. So there's a team that was building some of that. They also built some of the infrastructure around like the learning platform for our representatives to share information about the thousands of products that we had. I just happened to be the most knowledgeable on my team. Um, and then I was able to bridge the two teams that kind of needed to work hand in hand instead of throw stuff over the wall. A lot of times in companies, in many, many, many companies, there's a lot of this throw over the wall experience. The developers can do it, so let's hand it to them and hope they can. Um, but it's never a let's work together and figure out what you need and what I can do, um, because a lot of a lot of people don't speak the same language in terms of development. Like I can speak super technical, probably have people have glazed over as they've listened, um, but being able to break that down into something where it's like, oh, you want a button that does X, Y, or Z. That was kind of my role there, is trying to really understand business goals and interpret them into either my work or the dev team's work.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up because
Yeah.
when you were describing it, I imagined you coming into this like not very small, but like this small company with a widespread thing, and everyone's sort of just not really knowing, and they're like, "Hey, this guy knows computers. We're gonna make him do all this stuff." Because I've had that
Yeah.
experience before.
I mean, it was definitely the computer guy needed on the non-technical team that needed the technical support. But I was by no means the smartest person in the room at any point. So
Mhm. Okay, well let's move on to number two or whatever.
yeah,
I think I interrupted you. I'm sorry if I did, but
yeah, no, that's
uh,
fine. Feel free to interrupt at any point. I probably have a lot of answers to things. So I was at Armstrong, and I had started an official company at that point called Level Two Studios, which kind of brought the guys I played video games with together. We were already doing software development for small things, and we actually ended up doing a bit more. We did some software, some website presence, some print. We built an application that I think 20 or 30 college campuses used for um, displaying digitally some of their signage. So in a lot of college campuses, where you go to get your information is actually in or around like the food halls. There's post boards or various other things that get put up, posters that get created with events for the month. We built a digital version of that a few schools were able to kind of share and use. So the students, all they had to do is scan a code, and they'd have the app. It would get notifications to say, hey, guess what? Tater tots are on sale because we made way too many of them this morning. Come get them now. Something that you wouldn't be able to do normally. All the way up through, like, just a reminder, we have this event happening tomorrow, so make sure to park on this side of the lot. Like various things like that. It was kind of cool. It grew a lot faster than we were expecting it to. But that was a really cool moment where I was able to own a product fully. A lot of times you don't get that in even medium to small companies. Like there's a lot of people that have their hands in a project, but it was me and a couple other guys that really rocked it out for that. So that was Level 2 Studios, which was more or less a side gig for a while. It was kind of part-time. I transitioned into a company called Atomic Object, which another Michigan company, amazing company. This is where I think I grew the most. This is where I started understanding all of the bits and pieces that I didn't know. And that's one of the things coming out of college. You're like, okay, I'm a hot shot. I'm ready. I passed all my courses. I aced all my tests. And then the real world hits you, and it's just like, oh, there's a lot more out there. And this is kind of where it hit. So about a year later, at Atomic Object, it was a full stack shop. So I was able to write some server software, some front end software, iOS, Android, web, like touch everything. Again, another thing you don't get in school. A lot of times in school, you get put into either a front end or back end category. You get to do server work, or you get to do the fancy button click work, but you don't do it all. I mean, it's probably changed since everything is now written in JavaScript with Node and JavaScript as a whole. But at Atomic Object, it was pretty cool because that's where I got a handful of mentors that kind of lifted me out of, hey, this is as far as I can go right now because I'm only 23. I'm not going to be able to get anywhere. And instead, it was, hey, here's some books to read. Here's a way to grow yourself that's not just like come to work, hammer at some keys, hope you learn something. And that kind of solidified my drive to, you know, you learn a little bit on the job, but you learn a lot more outside of it. So keeping on top of your tech or keeping on top of your area of expertise is something that we all should be doing because your job's not going to just teach you. In reality, it's more like they expect you to know. So that was a great experience, and that's actually where I started pushing more into game dev. A bunch of the guys there were writing their own game systems. So one guy was writing a Ruby game engine because we're a Ruby shop, and it was kind of fun because he's like, "Yeah, you shouldn't really write a game in Ruby, but I'm going to." And then a few of us, we built some networked web games for a few game jams, and that's where I was kind of getting the spark of, well, I got to move my career into games.
Yeah, that's where you decided this is where I'm going to make this transition out of development in sort of this all these other industries into games specifically. Just for those who aren't like super familiar with development and stuff like that, what's the difference between a full stack engineer and like a back end and a front end? Full stack is all encompassing.
Yeah, so full stack is someone who, if you put them in a room, could essentially write everything from the server to the front end. They could write the server that manages your passwords, your data, write it securely, write it quickly, and then write the stuff that we interact with, which is the front end, the thing you see in your browser or the thing that pops up on your app on your phone. So they're able to comprehend and understand the languages that go into all of that, the data transfer that makes up those systems. Whereas like a backend is just the person who tends to work on the servers, doesn't tend to like or doesn't have like the expertise. They might like it, but they don't generally have the expertise around design. So the front ender is the person who generally translates the business goals into clickable and touchable things, but through the lens of their designer. So being able to understand design and apply that is a huge difference with like a front end or a full stack person.
And as projects get larger and as the scope of things get bigger, do you see full stacks sort of getting zoned out and more people like focusing in on specific things?
Yeah, we'll jump forward briefly. At Cryptic and other game studios, you tend to see it split up drastically.
Mhm.
So you'll see people who are working on front end UI, like myself. So I work on just the UI on the front end. I don't write any of like the server code or client code. Then you'll have the client guys who work on maybe Windows or the consoles or various other things, and they work at potentially the layer of or a couple different layers. One might be audio, one might be 3D and graphics, another might be just taking all of like the game understanding of how you interact, so the game systems, the game data, and applying that into how the world or worlds or levels play out. So there's 4 or 5 right there on just like the quote unquote front end. Um, then you have the back end, which could be split into a bunch of different things because you have different stores and different currencies and different account needs. You have different server types. Like speaking of WoW or League of Legends, you have something that stands alone, which is called like your login server.
Mhm.
And there's people who just maintain your accounts. They don't maintain anything that goes into the games. They don't maintain anything that goes into the rest of your experience, but just your data and how that gets passed between all the systems. So full stack really doesn't exist. You might be kind of cross stack at one end or the other. So you might be a client full stack. So you could do some audio, you could do some 3D, you could do some UI. Smaller studios, you might get the chance to do the non-client work, but it really starts breaking apart the larger the project and the larger the teams. So that's where, going back to the schooling part, being a jack of all trades doesn't really help, because if you have that aha moment and you go, oh, my client's not behaving because I'm getting this wrong thing from the back end, when in reality it's maybe one of the back end pieces that gets filtered through 3 different like front end layers. Yeah, we can go on to fun stories of chasing bugs later.
Speaking off the cuff just a bit, do you think games and projects lose a tiny bit of like that magic when you sort of segment them out so much, or do you think they actually get better when you have? I mean, of course they get better because there's more people working on them, but if you had the perfect project, would you want to work on it with only like people who focus on everything, or would you want everybody specialized?
I think specialization comes in very, very nicely with the roaming uh, know-it-alls, I guess. Not in a bad way, know-it-all, but like the person who can jump in anywhere. They're great at development. They're great at bug fixing. They can hop into the front end, the back end, the client code, the server code, um, because those are the people that kind of drive. If you were to think of it like, take a ball of yarn and you set it in one person's hand and you say you need to get it to someone else, you got to have that person who can really speak the language all the way up the line, because you can't all speak the language. And as I said earlier, if you have too many non-specialized people in the room, you don't all know things to the depth that you might need. So
Mhm.
looking at something like a shooter, those servers run quickly. For a while there, they would run at like 12 or 20, or maybe if you're lucky, 30 frames per second on the server, even if your machine's running at 144 frames. The server's only calculating so many frames, so there's a lot of magic to make the smoothness. Now, you need someone super super specialized to really hone that down and say, I can get the server to run 60 frames a second, maybe 120 frames per second, and then shots land and they feel good. You get that like final click and you beat somebody by like a very small fraction of a second to that win condition, when before maybe the slower tick servers wouldn't allow it. You
Mhm.
feel that expertise of the person who's able to hone in on that craft. Same with the UI, same with any other like part of a project. You have to have some really really deep divers to really drive excellence in things.
So if I'm calculating, or if I'm remembering correctly, we started with Armstrong, we
Yep.
transitioned into level 2 as sort of a side gig, and then
Yep.
we are at Atomic.
Yep.
Is there anything between Atomic and Cryptic?
Yeah, a handful of things.
Okay, let's go.
I get into my game career kinda.
Oh.
Uh, so I'd moved from Atomic out to Sony in LA. I was working with a smaller studio called Loot Interactive. they had a few games of their own, and then they were doing a lot of game porting. So bringing indie games to the Sony line, being able to play those indie games on a Sony platform where an indie developer might only have a couple people and they don't really have the hardware or the know-how to make their iOS game perform well. So I was with that company. It was a contract to hire, and then the big Sony hack hit before I got my conversion. So I didn't stay there super long, but in my like 5 months there, I actually helped build a platform for um, iterating on video services on the Sony line of the Vita, PlayStation 3, and 4. So I worked on things like Crackle and MLB and um, built out the entirety of the first version of Red Bull TV. So while it wasn't explicitly gaming, I got to deal with all the fun joys of console certification and building on a dev kit and understanding that it's not just my computer that runs the game at points. I'm sending it across the server to something else and it just dies because, well, it doesn't like the way I've written my code. Whereas the server emulator, yeah, that's fine. It's easy. Um, so that was a fun misstep, I would say. It got me out to LA where I was a lot closer to games. Previously, I was in Michigan, so there was like 2 studios, and they were either full up or just didn't want to hire me because I had no game experience. Which it's hard to get game experience in a place that has no games. Um,
The thriving game hub of Michigan.
yeah, I mean there was S2 Studios there, which did like Heroes of New Earth and Strife and a few others, which great games. Um, I think that was about it. There was something in Detroit. So the thriving metropolis of all of those game studios. But in LA, there was a lot more. So I bailed before I was given the official boot because they were getting rid of all the contracts, and it was an interesting time, especially the day that all of our computers had that skull face on the screen.
Oh,
So
boy.
much fun. Um, and I had been pursuing Riot actually. Let's see, since the start of when I was at Atomic Object. So I had pursued Riot for a couple of years. I had a few interviews, just kind of missed the mark every so often because they have a high bar, which is great. They make some really, really great things. So they have a high bar, and they have a lot of viz. So they have that ability to be picky. But I landed at a company called Ludomade, which they were an offshoot of a company called Soap Interactive, partly agency. So we would do websites and promotional pieces for media. We did a lot with Fox and Disney and Sony and other companies. But I actually head up their web games team. So we built a lot of promotional web games, things for like USA Network's Colony show. We built a series of games that released with the episodes that had tie-ins and various things there. I was able to build out, I think, 3 different iterations of engines that we used in-house for web games. And the reason we had so many is we had one that was like super robust, could do anything, had 3D, had all of the bells and whistles, was kind of a clunker, but it worked well. We had a middle range, which was one we were phasing out, and then we had the super, super trim one for something that was an awesome innovation. I built one of the first games that lived on Snapchat. So when you're scrolling through Snapchat, or I don't know how it works anymore, but back in the day, between some of the stories, you get an ad and you could swipe up and go to a page. I built a game engine that would load so quickly that when you swiped up, you felt like you almost opened a new app. And so we were able to build promotional games. One of the big ones was for Serena Williams when she was going for her 23rd win. Unfortunately, she didn't make it that time, but with Gatorade, we built a little tennis game where you could celebrate all of her 22 wins prior. So it was a really cool, like pixel animated, very Twitch gamey setup, and it was a pivotal moment because I got to work with technology teams in another company building this thing that Snapchat was like, it should work. I think it works. And then when I sent it to their developer and they're like, it doesn't work, being able to like remotely debug and figure out why a game isn't working when it works locally, which is the
It works on my machine.
it works here. Yeah.
Oh, Lord.
So that was a fun experience. I was able to do some level design for the Uncharted mobile game. So when Uncharted 4 came out, they released a companion mobile game on iOS and Android, which, as you beat through some of the puzzles, you were able to unlock things for the game. So it's pretty cool because that was a great moment to flex other skills other than software development and digging into code. It was making puzzles and making puzzles that were challenging and exciting and gave you those thrill moments when you solved them, or gave you those really unfortunate moments when like you saw the solve but failed. You're just like, oh, if I would have made that one move. And it was great because you could hear people throughout the office when they're playing your level. One guy would always be like, "Oh, Jared," and it's like, "Oh, he got to level 12." And so you get to see the signature of others. I worked with a team that built those levels, and you knew who designed certain levels based on some of the puzzles, and you'd be able to like pick up your Nerf gun and shoot him across the way when you couldn't pass it. But yeah, it was a really interesting spot because we were a smaller studio. I think we had 45 of us at our peak, but we operated usually around 25 to 40, depending on some of the projects we needed people for. Got to touch Unity, got to touch all sorts of things. So that was a spot where I was able to kind of go wild in game dev. And I'll let you ask questions because I'm sure there's a ton here.
Yeah, did you feel like that was the place where you grew the most in terms of game dev? I know you said Atomic was where you grew the most in terms of just growing, but for this, it
Yes.
seems like you did so many different things. So
Yeah, so Atomic Objects where I grew in like development and professional areas, and then when I was at Ludomade, that's where I grew a lot in games. I touched a ton of different types of architectures. Um, I forgot about it. One of the last projects there, in like a month, I cranked out a game that we used in a live experience with Adidas on a 75-inch touchscreen TV that people could go win prizes off of. So it was a point where I was able to really innovate and grow and own bits and pieces of the project because we had 4 or 5 major projects at one time. So there wasn't super delineated. You get this and you get that. Instead, it was you need to make this work amongst the 4 of you. Good luck. I think we've got enough of the skill sets in there. Tap someone else in if you need it. So it was a moment where it's like it kind of was a trial by fire. And at certain points, it was staying late at the office because I really messed up with one bug and I don't know where it was, or the little bit of crunch time we'd have here and there really allowed me to pick brains of some of my peers and understand what they were making in games as well.
in terms of oversight, not oversight as in missing something, but oversight as in people who are like sort of looking down and being in charge of these projects, it doesn't sound like there was a ton. Do you think that it was mostly just a get this done and do it however you see fit sort of situation?
It was a unique role. The agency had a couple leads. I think it was a CEO and a COO at the time that were kind of overseeing everything that came in. Um, but they allowed us to do the pitching. They allowed us to do all of the work. When I say pitching, we pitched some projects to other companies. Like if we wanted to win Disney or Fox, we either brought some prototypes up or said, "Hey, we know this is upcoming. We've got a game or a website or an experience for you. Do you want to work with us?" And then really come up with these things where you'd go into the studio and present to someone who made time for you. um, and it was really cool because like the two leads kind of pushed us in directions and made the big calls, and then they're like, now you guys execute, you guys work on it. This is our need and this is our outcome, and this is like the line in the sand or the standard we have to hit. And so I think it was a great spot where we were able to build and grow, and it became more of challenge one another, not what do I need to do and how do I need to get there. Instead, how can we go above and beyond? And so I think that was, while it didn't have a project owner at all points, I think we all took role in project ownership. I owned a few projects, a few other people owned a few projects. Um, and then we worked with our teams to really say, hey, this is what we need done. How can we work together?
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing environment to mature in as a game developer. And obviously, I don't have any great perspective to put a spin on that, but I think that if I was in game dev, that would be sort of the environment where I'd want to check out and sort of figure out where I want to go and take that direction. And the next step
Yeah.
that you took was,
Yeah, so I'll round that one out quick. Those environments are great. They can also be double-edged swords. That's why we had
Mhm.
3 different game engines for the web, and then there was Unity and other stuff because, well, it was quicker for someone to make something in something else. So why not?
Mhm.
So it's a great environment. It can be a double-edged sword, but as long as you put the focus in, it's it's growth. But from there, I went to a company called Left Field Labs, which broke me away from games for a little bit. I was able to do some games and gamification, but I think what had peeled me away was um, games are tough. When you get into a studio, there's a lot of times people who have ideas and goals and drives for the game or for certain parts. And sometimes you get into studios where there's no drives, ideas, and goals for certain parts, and instead there's like a business outcome of the game or a
Yeah.
general like story view of the game, and then everything in between is kind of ambiguous. What that tends to lead to is crunch time, which is a terrible thing in the games industry and something that I'm sure a lot of developers have heard about, will hear about, will still continue to experience. Um, but I'll have to say this too: crunch time happens everywhere. Crunch time happened when I was back in college and I was picking up extra shifts at the restaurant because someone was sick or we
Mhm.
had a party come in. Crunch time happened when I was in the automotive factory as a parts inspector because we were behind in parts. So I have to like stop that myth there that it's just games that has it. But games can especially have it because there is creative drive and vision, and it can be overwhelming at points. So I got fed up with that, and I said I want to take a breather. I want to move to something where I can uh, kind of not burn out of the games industry before I just don't want to do games anymore because ultimately I wanted to do games. So I went to Left Field Labs, which is a studio that does all sorts of things. When I had started, they were doing some mobile and web experiences. We did things like we helped with Uber's American Sign Language initiative. So at the early days of Uber and Lyft, um, you could get a deaf driver or a deaf passenger or someone hard of hearing, and if you have no understanding of ASL, you wouldn't be able to communicate with them. So we,
Mhm.
we helped build an app that showed you how to sign your name using just like letters in ASL, how to say a few things like mine stops up here or to the right, or how are you today, and have that engaging moment. So we'd built a lot of stuff where it was intended to make a change in the world. I got to work on a really great app for Discovery Kids, which is basically a kids focused Netflix. So
Mhm.
they partner with a bunch of different groups, PBS. I think they had some Disney stuff on there and a few other content providers to have shows. And then as soon as they started building it, we started building games in. So I was able to like use my games experience from Ludomade to build in a web engine for mobile devices of 5, 6 year old caliber to run web games really quickly. So it was a great point where I was able to harness some of like my game experience. But also you look at data differently and you look at interactions differently in like just a standard web app and a game. So being able to kind of merge those things gives you memorable experiences, I should say. So something where if you gamify or make a button come alive on a site, sometimes it just is really cool. You hover that submit button or that sign in button, and a little shine goes across it, and it bounces. It's like, oh, that wasn't really gamified. That wasn't really like giving me points, but it's an interaction that like a game developer might notice more than a front end web dev.
Yeah. I
So
actually want to jump in real quick and
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
commend you for that. I know it wasn't solely your mission, but the mission of creating a better environment for kids to be able to consume entertainment. Because I actually work in the educational technology industry, and I work in a part that monitors and looks at suicide and self harm alerts for these young K through 12 children. And a lot of the things that I see in this industry is media that is leading children into these sort of mindsets of self-harm. And it's just what I see mostly is kids consuming media that wasn't intended for them or wasn't made with them in
Yep.
mind. So I definitely really, I know that this has been attempted in a lot of different places, and I hope we see more of this in the future. But I think the idea of a platform dedicated towards kids where they can consume media that won't really be as harmful as some of the stuff out there that we have is a great idea. So I definitely want to point that out because I thought that was really interesting.
Thanks. I mean, it's pretty cool too with the way like you can lock an iPad or an Android device into an app. So if you lock them into an app that's got games and videos and various things and say, "Have fun, kid," uh, it provides that experience where you know that it should be safe or at least safer than letting
Safer.
them grab the remote or scroll through YouTube and then end up in a really dark part of YouTube. So it's yeah, it was a great feeling to have that, and it was a great spot to be because you also get to see the world differently. We did some user testing, and you're just like, oh, a kid didn't notice that, or a kid picked up on this one thing that I never would have.
Mhm.
And children are bright. They are incredibly bright, and it's just cool to see the world differently. We all get jaded as we age, and we assume that the close button is going to be in the top right corner, and that when there's a play button, I'll get audio or video. And sometimes you don't even need any of that to have an engaging experience. So being able to take that moment and make something great, but also expand like, oh yeah, Jared, get out of your mind and get into other people's minds to understand different experiences really helped grow me as a person too.
Yeah, and like you said, kids are smart. It's a terrible combination. They're smart. They have so much free time on their hands, and they're very technologically literate. Um, uh, the unfortunate reality, or fortunate, depending on how you look at it, is that kids these days are getting access to technology at incredibly young ages, and they're going to be able to do things that maybe a normal person can't even understand. Like people who work in the computer industry have a much better perspective on how technology works, but parents who just want to keep their kid quiet for a few hours or get some rest after a hard day at work and hand their kid an iPad might not realize the impact that that's having on these kids. So I think having
Yeah.
more focus on giving a better environment for kids to grow up in and not just giving them the reins to the internet, which is a terrifying place. It's definitely something that I hope more people focus on. So it's scary, and kids. I remember myself growing up because I think I'm a little bit younger than you, maybe 4 or 5 years. Um, but I grew up in a world sort of pre technology overtaking everything, but transitioning into that as I got into my teenage years. So I missed out on that young age attached to a computer 24/7. And I think that is really leading some of these very worrying trends that we have in younger kids today, where they get access to technology at the age of 5 or 6, and
Yeah,
just
because
never goes away.
they're carrying around that iPhone because you can't buy a flip phone anymore, or it's
Mhm.
very hard to. And so the
And
internet's right there at their fingertips.
you don't want to you don't want to have your kid be the only kid in elementary school or whatever with a Nokia brick phone. They're gonna get made fun of. Kids are also mean. That's another thing that people forget. Kids are very mean, and they'll bully you for anything. They'll bully you for having a flip phone, for not having high. I remember growing up, I had dial-up internet until I was like 12, and that was way later than most people my age. And I was like, I'd have to go over to people's houses to download files and stuff on my little fake laptop, because our dial-up wouldn't work.
Oh
So
yeah, and then you realize that the $100 you spent on that 512 gig like USB drive went to waste because it was 600 or 512 meg. Sorry.
yeah,
So the 512 meg, you downloaded 514 megs because it's like a game demo or something, and then you're just like, "Ugh, I can't bring it home."
yeah. It's, I don't know. The technology has changed so much in the past 10 years, and it's sort of easy to forget if you sort of grew up during that time. But it's crazy how much my life has been changed by technology over the past 10 years versus these days. I think it's evolving very quickly, but I don't think it has been at the rate where it was for somebody like my age or your age, where it literally transitioned from a hobby to a life for a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
That was a bit of a tangent. I'm sorry for for getting off on
No,
that.
that's fine. Rabbit holes are a fun thing to dive down into. But popping back out of that, I think I was describing some of the things I was able to do at Left Field Labs. I'll finish out with saying the company grew and expanded. We were able to do really cool stuff like uh, building connected devices for show floors. I traveled to a few different cities and a few different countries for larger conferences where we networked stations on a certain part of the conference floor that if you scanned in, you might show up on a screen elsewhere, or you might be able to interact with someone at a different part of the booth. Um, so like as the company grew and we had more minds come in that said this is a fun thing to do, we were able to go into like microcontroller technology and using like Raspberry Pis and very similar devices to build connected experiences, which I think again was a great spot for me as a game developer because like a Raspberry Pi, a tiny little computer, you can program something on it. You can put a bunch of those together in terms of like networking them and build games out of them, like physical space-based games, which allows you to think outside of what's on my screen and what's on my controller, but like what's in my space. Um, so there's a lot of fun there. I moved into management of the tech team there, so I was a technical director for a while at Left Field Labs, which is really interesting to see business that way because the time smacking keys and making code appear uh, was lessened drastically over time. And instead, I was writing technical documents to like push my teams forward, which is another great aspect, even at early stages in one's career, is trying to understand all the bits and pieces that go together to build the application versus like I own this little button and the buttons around it. And so I think thinking broadly, being able to do that early in my career set me up for running that side of the business for a while. So being a tech director, I was managing people and projects, project outcomes, really understanding the life cycle versus the minutia of the day to days. And then after a while with that, I was like, I need to get back into games. I need to be coding again, and that transitions into Cryptic, which a handful of months ago, mid last year, I actually had a few different game studios approach me, which is an awesome spot because I was still on the side contributing to game jams and to open source game tools, which is a great way to get yourself noticed, get noticed by developers who might use your thing, and then they might want to bring you onto the team. Um, and then in all that, I can't remember how it happened, but I just ended up in an interview with Cryptic, and being a D&D fan, they have Neverwinter.
Mhm.
Being a Magic player, they have Magic Legends, which is what I'm working on. Um, the technology stack that we use actually used a lot of similar tech for what I did in web. So it was like all these pieces aligned, and the game gods said, "Welcome back," and that's kind of where I'm at now.
So, not to put you on the spot too much, but over the past
Yep.
years of your education and employment, not including Cryptic, what would you say were some of the major, like, best parts of that time? Like, where
Yeah.
would you say
Best.
your favorite role was?
Oh man, I think I constantly go back to where I grew and how the company was run with Atomic Object. It was a smaller studio, and while it wasn't game design, the CEO and the co-leads were really all about building people up. At Atomic Object, they were very much kind of like how I described Ludomade. The higher ups brought in the projects and then they handed it off to a team. So there would be usually a team of us, uh, two or three developers, two or three designers, and we would own the project. We'd communicate with the client. We would scope the project. We would talk to the client about, hey, we're ahead, we're behind. Here's where your budget's at, and really own the product. And like I said, while that wasn't games, it was very fulfilling to see from all aspects how the project is going and to see my daily impacts. We did a lot of tracking of tickets, estimating of tickets being things that we would have to work on. So in project software, you'd create a task or a ticket, you'd assign a number to it, which usually seemed arbitrary, but that number tracked against other tickets. And eventually you could kind of have a very, very solid estimate of the project. I think that was just really cool to have an understanding of knowing almost down to the day when something could be done, provided there were no changes. So it was fulfilling. That's where I had some of my bigger mentorships, or where I was a mentee. And so I think that grew me the most. And I continue to refer to some of the ways that we scoped projects and the ways that we ran projects, both in direct reference to like my peers and sometimes indirectly, like, oh yeah, I know how to solve this. Um, I think content wise, my favorite up until Cryptic was Ludomade, because I was making games and games and games and games. I looked back at my list the other day and I think I had 43 different games that I had built. Um, and they're not all like 700 hours of Skyrim quality, but they were things like you could spend a few hours in it. Or they were experiences that were connected to 7 other games. So that was, I think, content wise, that was fun. But I don't feel like I leapt ahead, somewhat like we were talking about technology before. Atomic Object was my 10 years ago technology. Ludomade was my like nowadays technology, in terms of the speed that growth happened.
That's awesome. I love these analogies that you have. I think you have a great gift in terms of translating all of this technical knowledge and your experience into something that people like me can understand.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's one of the things that I think a good developer has is a software developer needs to be able to communicate.
Mhm.
Um, And early on, I said I can talk super technical. I think the biggest thing was how can I not? How can I talk super low tech or no tech? And that if I can understand the low tech or no tech side, I can translate it to tech in my brain. Don't worry about that. I can ask those questions like, do you need this buffer or do you need that set of memory? You don't know. You don't care. You just want it to work. So it's. I think that's another like back to what you should know, kids. Is being able to take away your expertise and talk at a human level is incredible. Um, they say some of the best hackers are the ones who have that human level of engagement, because 90% of hacking is usually socially.
Mhm.
So if I can get your password, if I can get you to let me follow you in, there you go. So if you want to be a hacker, if you want to be a developer, just be a person.
Yeah, there's that's a great example because I remember looking into a lot of this, the larger hacks that have happened recently for some of the more prominent online people. It usually ends up being, and this one is a little scary. A lot of the times, it's people calling into phone companies and sort of social engineering them to give away SIM cards or stuff like that, where they'll transition the person's phone over to themselves, like via no, uh, there's a word for it, like no penetration of themselves. Is like
Yeah.
very basic
They
hacking
don't need
per
a
se.
password. They don't need anything. They just need to pretend they're a personal assistant or something. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of companies. When I was in Los Angeles, um, one of my roles with Left Field Labs let me work with Google as a contractor through Google. We had a lot of Google projects. When you go to their campuses, at every door, they've got cute little cartoon gators that say "No tailgaters." And that's one of the big things. Like you walk up to a door and you're carrying what looks to be your lunch, and you go, "Oh, hold the door." You don't know who that person is unless you actually know them. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Tangent aside.
No, it's really interesting, and maybe one day I can have somebody on the show who has like a lot of experience with more of like the human side of security, because there's so much that people don't think about, and I've seen a lot of stuff online where people sort of describe all these security practices, and it can be as simple as, like you said, a sign that says "No tailgaters," somebody bumping off your key guard and just and entering the door behind you. Um, and it really is very surprising how relaxed people get in an environment where they're working with sensitive data, and you're like, never put your password in a plain text file on your desktop, but people are going to do it anyway, or never put
Don't God write it on
forbid.
that sticky
Never
note.
put a sticky note. Oh Lord. Or don't use your kid's birthday or something that you talk about. Yeah.
Or your pet's name. Yeah.
Yeah. It's there's a lot of different stuff that people who may not be interested in the tech world, um, like they forget about security because they think that like 90% of all this computer stuff is somebody hacking in with their little hackertyper.com with their sunglasses on and everything. But no, like you said, most of it's just figuring out stuff that people have been lax about and where's the least defensive area that they can get into. Um,
Yep. Which,
yeah.
I mean, to round that out, I think is something that developers have to understand on all areas, back end, front end, etc. So I think that's something that as a developer I have to grin at every time I see the no tailgaters. It's like, well, I got to solve that in my code too.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, I'm sure we could have a really interesting conversation about that. I'm thinking of all these tangents, but I want to keep
It
things
is,
slightly on track because I do actually have a time. Normally, I start um, earlier, but it's actually 9:50 already. Um,
yeah, and I had to
s-
take the dogs out, so I started us
no,
later.
no, no, it's not your fault at all. Um, just I shifted over to a night shift at my job, and it's really messed with my scheduling for stuff. So I've been trying to
Oh man,
figure out ways to make that work out for stuff like this. And it actually opened up more opportunities for the show because I
nice.
don't have to start after 8 p.m. at night anymore, which is a nightmare for people across the country. But
Oh
anyway,
yeah,
um, we already talked a bit about how you joined Cryptic. You said it was a bit of a blur, but you had some stuff out there and people approached you and you got into interviews and they liked you apparently. Um,
yeah. I mean, it was like I said, it was a bit of a blur because I had a bunch of open interviews. I had a bunch of large projects. We were in the middle of COVID at that point. Like the business world was kind of topsy turvy.
yeah, man. Whoa, yes, this was very recent. So something that I have been monitoring is that job like transitions got demolished during COVID. Like nobody was hiring. My company completely froze hiring except for a few essential positions that they needed people for. So yeah, getting a job in the middle of that's definitely no small feat. So uh,
It felt kind of like a domino effect. Like you had to wait for a domino to fall off elsewhere
mhm,
that you could go fill. So like if enough people left a company somehow, you could go fill one of those roles, and then companies would open them up for like tiny windows of time. But yeah,
mhm,
it was kind of strange.
super on top of things. And hopefully we're getting out of that right now. I think that we've maybe entered the home stretch of things. So now might actually be a really good time to get into game dev and in the software world in general because I predict that there's going to be a very big hiring surge at the end of this tunnel for companies who haven't been hiring as much. And I know some companies haven't cared at all since they're all remote anyway, so they've just kept things going. But a lot of companies haven't. So keep an eye out for
Yeah,
that. Definitely something to
totally.
look out for.
And a lot of
Uh,
companies have transitioned to understanding what it's like to work remote now. So I think this is a great spot too. There's lots of openings that are starting to show up.
Yeah, it's way easier. I don't want to say it's way easier, but it's a lot different trying to get a job at an LA company when you're not in LA when they're actually acceptable of remote employees. Because I know a lot of these software companies and games companies will be like, "Hey, we need you to relocate to Los Angeles," and at the end of the day, what that ends up being is a lot of the time they'll go for a local candidate over you, because it's
Yep.
just way easier for them. They get in-person interviews, they get cheaper moving expenses, they get everything. It's just simpler. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, but right now, remote work has changed all that. So don't don't write off your chances for working at a bigger company. Maybe you have a slot there that you haven't thought was possible to fill before. But transitioning back into Cryptic, um,
Yep.
I actually want to talk a bit about Magic Legends because I myself am not a Magic player, but I have lots of friends who love Magic. What type of game is Magic Legends for people who are familiar with the Magic universe?
Yeah, so if you were to take Magic card play, deck building, etc., which there's a great video that our lead designer for that system had put out just a couple days ago. IGN picked it up, and I believe it's on most, if not all, of the Cryptic channels right now. Go take a look at it. There's a deck building aspect where you build a small deck, and then imagine if you smash Diablo into that. So like the action RPG world, where there's loot and kind of a top-down experience, and you get to use a random spell hand of your deck. So bringing the magic side in, you don't know what that next card could be, so you'll draw it, and it could be useful now, or you might have to hang on to it. So that's the two worlds collide there, allowing you to build uh, a small hand that could be super potent, or it could be something that's like, if I have these spells together, it'll be great. But it has to work out, and so your skills are always changing out. But I think it adds to the fun because you don't have a full bar of skills like 8 or 10 or whatever Diablo might have. You have a much smaller hand at one point. Um, you have some secondary skills to keep the action flowing. Like if you want to hold on to some of your cards a little longer, cool, do that. So it kind of takes the beauty of a game of Magic. You get to see some of the spells and monsters and locations that you'd see in the game. In like the physical card game, but in the digital world. We are working alongside WotC to really make sure that we fit all of the Magic lore. WotC being Wizards of the Coast, who owns that IP. So it's not like we're taking a weird divergent path, but we're just kind of bringing that into a more digital space with some really fun effects.
And you said that you were obviously you're a fan of D&D and you play
Yep.
Magic the Gathering. So is there, like, pardon the pun, a bit of magic in terms of working on an IP that you have been a fan of for a while?
Yeah, there is a lot of magic there. Because I think what it is sometimes you get in the grind of the day to days. Today I was hunting down bugs, which not a ton of fun, diving through file after file to figure out where the data went. Um, and when you start going back to our chat earlier, where you turn off your brain and you get into that like weird spot, you also get into that when you're doing this rabbit hole of finding a bug, and it's just so frustrating. But knowing that you're building something that you can't wait to play and you can't wait to share with friends, and that you enjoy the IP and the characters and the art style, like it just makes it that much more amazing. Now, if I was on like Candy Crush or My Little Pony Online or one of those, it's still a game, cool. But at the end of the day, it's not something that I go, I can't wait to play that. I can't wait till we launch this piece. Um, so really being excited around the rest of the game helps pull my attention to all areas, even to the point of like drawing my attention further than what my role technically allows me to influence. Like, oh, what if we did this? Oh, I'll talk to systems so they can get into the system later. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And my introduction to Cryptic Studios was actually, like you mentioned it a little earlier, Neverwinter. The Neverwinter MMO is and was the only MMO I've really ever gotten into. And me and a friend, Carter, if you're listening, um, we spent many hundreds of hours, probably shoot, maybe 2013 or 2014. It was a while back. Um, into it was before any of the major expansions launched, so it must have been early on in the dev cycle
Yeah.
for Neverwinter. But we played so much Neverwinter. And I came from a League background, so Neverwinter had this sort of draw to me where you don't have to manage 1,000 spell bars like WoW. And you just
Yeah.
had 4 spells, maybe a few more if you had some different stuff. So that's where the draw for me was. And then when you approached me, or I guess you approached me. I approached you for
Yeah.
this interview, and you said Cryptic. I'm like, that's really special. I never thought I'd be able to get to talk to somebody who is on the same company of a game that I spent probably north of 2,000 hours on growing up with my friends. So I want to
Yeah. I
bring
mean,
that up because I think that's a bit of that magic too.
yeah, I think that's a special thing is being able to understand the games just don't appear out of nowhere. There's some of us behind the scenes working tirelessly on those, and at the same time, when we hear, oh, these guys put thousands of hours into it. As a game developer, I even if it wasn't a game that I worked on, but it's something my studio worked on, I have this warm feeling in my heart, like, oh man, my coworkers did something that brought joy for thousands and thousands of hours versus oh yeah, it was that one game that you deleted immediately because it was boring. And so it's great because games are so subjective, and when you find people who really like the game or the style of game that you've worked on, um, those are people that provide great insight.
Yeah, it was a different experience for me. It was just something completely out of left field that I never thought I'd be into, but I think playing with a friend really drove that aspect of it, where it was like a bigger part of my life. Because coming from like League and Battlefield and Call of Duty, and I didn't play much Call of Duty. Shoot, Combat Arms. Have you ever played Combat Arms? Combat Arms. Played
Yeah,
a lot of Combat Arms growing up. Um, yeah, just having that ability to tune into this different style of game, and it was sort of my introduction to the D&D universe, um, where I just didn't get that anywhere else. Like you play a game like League, especially back in the day, they didn't really have that like rich story lore. Everything was sort of just like Grundle was the king of trolls. He was the troll king. Ash was the
fun.
queen of
Yeah,
the Freljord. She was the Freljord queen. And I think they've sort of transitioned a lot of that attention to detail into building a universe that people are excited for. But at the time, there was no competition for an established universe that has decades of people putting their lives into it. So I thought that was pretty neat too.
I mean
Even if at the
it's
time I didn't appreciate it as much.
it's rare to find that, and it usually manifests in big MMOs. But it's been cool to watch Riot kind of grow on that. I remember intro to some of the Riot IP was nothing was in the game, but when you went to the website, you could read the little blurbs and bios. And so yeah, I remember reading some of those similar things where it's like, there's nothing about them. What world am I playing in?
And that I think that's what's so exciting for fans of MMOs to know that Riot is actually working on their own um, MMO, whatever it's going to be.
Yeah,
Whenever it comes out, it's going to be years and years. But I think building that platform of an actual universe that people want to engage in and you can actually see in the game has been such a big building block that they've been focusing on, and that's why hopefully that's why they've been doing it, to transition
yeah,
into a universe that people actually care about. But transitioning back to Magic, a world that I don't know unfortunately a lot about, let's talk about we talked about what type of game it was and what the draw was for you. But
yeah.
what has the transition been out of sort of I know you said you spent a little while outside of game dev specifically. What has it been like transitioning back into game dev at Cryptic?
Yeah, so projects run differently, especially long run projects versus agency based projects. I spent a lot of time in agencies, so projects are shorter. I think the longest project in all of my career up until this point had been a year and a half, maybe 2 years, which seems like a big long running project, and it is. But when you get to something where it's got teams who have built the engine and teams who have built the story and whatnot 5, 6 years ago, pitched it through, got it running. You hear about iteration after iteration and like the packs reveal multiple years ago and how different the game has been. Um, it's cool to be in a spot where there's an ever changing environment. With the slippery slope of it's ever changing, so don't ever think what you did today is going to be final forever. You'll see that in games like WoW that have been running for 12 years now, something like that. That their UI and their character design, their storytelling has evolved. But to see a long run in how things are handled is really cool. I think the transition back into games has been kind of that sigh of relief because it's an area that I enjoy and am excited about. Not that any of the projects that I was on in any of the other companies were not like exciting or something that I didn't enjoy, but it was just like, oh, cool, I solved the problem. Give me a gold star, let's keep going. But it was never something I'd want to sit around and talk about. Now it's just like, to the extent that I can share for each of the games that I've worked on, past and current, it's something I go, oh yeah, I did this one little thing, and then the players broke it, or I stumped the players for so long, and that's a great moment. So being back in that field is amazing. Being at Cryptic, we use some web technology on Magic for our UI. So there's a lot of ways to put the UI elements on screen. Sometimes it's built really closely in engine. Um, I think Unity might have some web tech to lay on top. So like if you're a web developer, you can still work on games. Um, there's a handful of competitors for the product that we're using, but it's just a really cool uh, way to apply my knowledge. And then now I can see like what drives the rest of the game and how can I further myself outside of work to then maybe help out on the audio team or the graphics team or on another part of game X, game Y, or game Z, whatever comes in the company's future.
Definitely. Um, and not to put it too broad strokes,
Yeah,
but just in terms of a few sentences or a paragraph that you can give out to people who may not have been able to grasp everything coming out of this show, but showing in coming in to try and be at the base level. Like, what skills and what things would you focus on like right now if you wanted to get into your specific role at Cryptic? I keep
yeah,
calling it Cryptic.
Cryptic. Yeah, that's all right. I think there was another studio called Cryptark, so it's an easy mistake. I think in a couple sentences, don't limit yourself to just the exact thing that you want to do. So I'm a front end engineer who uses web technology. Uh, I shouldn't limit myself to that because there are plenty of areas that build up your expertise and knowledge in being able to contribute to a team. So for me, I studied user experience and UI from a design aspect. Knowing how someone will interact with your software helps you write better software because you might take less steps. Maybe you take more in order to make that interaction. But knowing how the end user is going to interact means you could even remove 17 clicks because in reality, if you want to do something in a game, you want less clicks and less button pushes to do that cool thing. Um, so for me, focusing on UI and UX is huge. And then also focusing on the business aspect, understanding what it's like to plan a project, to manage a project, and to run a project allows me to understand why my production team is making the choices they make.
Mhm.
Younger developers might come in and go, "Oh, why'd they put me on bug work? I don't want to do bug work." Or they might have cut a feature that I didn't want cut. Well, there's other aspects that go into what builds the game. And if you know that, you might be able to pitch back some of those ideas or better ideas later.
Yeah.
So super short. Know the business, know the project planning, know the expertise or a little bit of the expertise of the teams you'll work closely with. So for me, it's the UI guys. Knowing how to work with my UI team and understand what their outcomes are helps me understand what I might expect from them. So don't short circuit yourself to knowing only the thing you want to do, but know the things around that that build that role. Um, so that's a little more broad stroke, but for people who want to do game engineering and do something on the front end, maybe you don't want to do the 3D math and all of the audio design and whatnot, but you want to build the interfaces, the auction house or the inventory manager or showing off all the guns you've collected in whatever shooter you're playing. Um, I think the big thing there is find a couple studios, figure out what they use, and understand that technology and understand what it takes to build from the ground up. Make your own stuff, continue to make your own stuff, trash your stuff, and start over.
So if you're not in a professional world and you're
Yep.
not in the education scene, if you've already graduated college and you're not looking to get back into it, what
Yep.
would you do to gain these skills outside of that? I know you said that you worked on some game jam products. Would that be like forefront on that recommendation?
I think game jams are great, but they're also daunting if you're not ready to use a tool or not ready to try and pick up a tool in 24 or 48 hours, what have you. Um, I think the biggest thing is set yourself some deadlines and try to create a project in those deadlines. It's great to have a side project, but the terrible thing about side projects is you close the lid on them and you slide them across the desk, and life gets busy and things stack up. And then when you open it and you dig through all the cobwebs, you're like, oh, I started that 6 years ago. It's cool, but I'd have to start from scratch. So I think have some ongoing projects that are exciting to you. And if they stop, wrap them up. Don't just set them down. Wrap them up so you feel okay about your accomplishment. Archive them. write yourself a blog post, whether or not it goes live, whether or not it's just in your diary or journal or whatever. Um, Keep that for yourself, because those are points you can look back and go, oh yeah, I made this stupid little game that didn't really work. I enjoyed it. What did I enjoy about it? 5 years later, you look at it and go, I know I've grown from this point, but how did I grow? So have your side projects, set some timelines on them, and then really have your retrospectives on these projects, so that way you can see your growth. And I think that's the biggest thing, is not having retrospectives and not having markers doesn't let you see how far you've grown. Doesn't let you say, oh, I'm much closer to the game job now than I ever was, because you said, oh yeah, I made these 3 tic-tac-toe games. One was 3D and one had explosions in it. But how did you grow between them? Um, I think that's the core. And then surround yourself with others who are in similar spots or professionals. Meetups are one of the best things. While you shouldn't be going to them in person right now, there's plenty of them that have transitioned online. There's game jam meetups, there's game developer meetups, there's game engineer meetups. And engineer and developer could be two different things. One does all the scripting and one does all the tricky, fun stuff behind the scenes to make that 3D work. Um, Find those, find lots of them. Reddit is incredible. You can find so many communities there that will push you forward. Um, if you find a toxic community, immediately leave it. Get out of there. Don't let that hold you back. There's been a few communities that I've dropped into, and either the way they name some of their add-ons to the game engine are very like gross or sophomoric, and then they continue with that. It puts a terrible spin on things. Step
Yeah.
back, have fun with it, set your own goals, and I think as long as you surround yourself with people who are pushing you, go.
Yeah, definitely. I think I reiterating on that last point you made. You're not going to be getting any new fans for any sort of industry that you're working in if you're concentrating on pleasing the very small subset of people that are already doing something like this. So maybe consider taking a more professional approach towards stuff that you make, because you never know who's going to drop in and take a look at it and be impressed or unimpressed. Um,
And I think if you do stuff like game jams, which you'll eventually work to, those are great moments where you could make something really stupid, really silly. Some of the premise of the game might even be borderline like not work friendly. Uh, but the way you go about it and the way you build those things, people will pop in and they'll look at it and they'll go, "I remember that one because it was vulgar, but it was funny." I remember there was a few game jams where it's like those were mildly not work safe, and I shouldn't have opened them up at work, but um, you were like, oh, they did some really cool things the way they engage with the user. And then you remember those games and you wait for the person next year or next month, whenever the next game jam is. Um, so if you find a spot to stick and show off your talent and show what you've learned, that attracts people as well.
Definitely. And I know you've only been at Cryptic for a few months now, but I actually
Yeah.
wanted to talk to you about this because I think professional development is something that doesn't get focused on a lot in game dev, where people just sort of um, stay where they are until they're needed somewhere else. So, do you have anything in your brain, not to sound like an interviewer, but do you have anything in your brain in terms of where you want to be in a few years, where you want to change your career or how you want to develop your expertise?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I had done early on was I set a very lofty goal to hit by 30, which I didn't, which is great. I didn't hit my goal. Let me recalibrate and understand where I fell short. My goal at 30 was to be a lead for a game or a games team within a studio. Didn't hit it. Awesome. Recalibrating that would be in the next few years where I'm at and the teams that I'm around, being able to potentially lead up another game or take over a game within Cryptic would be great. Being like the go-to guy for the overall, the planning, the ideas, the development, etc. Um, and knowing how some of the technical teams work and some of the design teams work, being able to apply that where um, sometimes you get project leads, and I was at a company a handful of years ago, won't mention which one it is, but a project lead sometimes is disconnected from the day-to-days. And so when they make a request, when they say it's just a little button, um, it's never just a little button. But knowing how to speak that to your teams is something that I want to be able to kind of push back into the idea of game development. So super lofty would be being able to bring that to other studios, whether or not that's coalitions or various other things. But being able to talk games and being able to talk games well, not just I want to have a shooty thing, but I want to make it fun for everyone involved, the players and the developers and designers alike. So that's like my super lofty goal. Being like a head of a project is probably the next 5 year idea as to where I'm going.
Who knows? Maybe we'll get to revisit you in a few years, and we'll be able to come
Maybe.
back and see. We'll go back into the old episode, and we'll see if these goals came to fruition or not.
Oh
But
man, going back into the old episode, ugh. And
yeah,
it'll be
I'm sure everyone's gonna enjoy that.
it'll be when you have your holodeck show that shows in full 3D in someone's home, because 5 years from now,
Oh yeah,
you might be running a whole network.
yeah. Who knows? Uh, so last question, and then we're gonna wrap
Yeah.
things up. I've been trying to push this a little bit more recently. Who do you
Yep.
have in your life, or who has been in your life, who is a source of inspiration for you, and specifically like somebody that you look to like get out of bed in the morning and do your job?
Yeah, I have a couple people, and I think for good reason. I have three people that I worked with. Two of them were mentors of mine when I was at Atomic Object, and one was a guy who became a good friend. Um, I think those three guys had kind of shaped my perspective on development and approaching games. The two mentors really shaped my development and just like being a human. I remember a handful of times, one of my mentors who is super straight faced about everything would just like turn and stare at me and be like, "You need to proofread your emails," and then he'd turn back, and I'm just like, I don't know if I was just reprimanded or if he just kind of told me what to do, but I really took to heart some of the things where it's like, you don't have to be sat down and slapped on the hand for something you did wrong, but more like a just always continue to improve yourself. Him and I actually, for a while, had gotten into a thing where we had bowls of quarters. We sat in close proximity in an open office environment. We had bowls of quarters and we had words that we would catch one another on. So things like if I used filler words to make sure my sentence didn't have a gap in it, I had a few filler words that I wanted to get out of my vocabulary. Uh, it was great because we had a moment where the bowls would change. And so it's like someone who's always challenging you in various ways. That's why I looked to that guy. One of the other guys was because he looked at games as I love to be in them. I love to be creating them professionally, but I also understand my limits and my expectations. And so he really kind of put the bounds on like what it is to be a dreamer. Not that you should have bounds on your dreams, but you should also think realistically. Like sometimes if I were to say, oh man, I want to be a jockey and I also want to be on a spaceship, that's a lot of work for both. And I also don't fit the height or weight requirement for the jockey and probably not the physique for being an astronaut. So it's like being able to kind of harness that is a huge thing. And then I also have to, for the person daily that I look to, and see every morning would be my wife. She is always challenging me in ways to um, remember things around the home because I get absent-minded in the way I think about like a problem and it sticks. So, I get the milk out, set it on the countertop, and I hear, oh yes, remember things. But it's also that she is super intelligent and she's actually going back to work on her master's to
Oh wow.
continue growth. And so it's one of those things where it challenges me to go, oh, how can I be better? Even if I'm not going for a degree or a degree add-on, it's how can I always be growing myself? And to see someone who challenges me that way with the way she has owned her career path in this. She's doing some extra undergrad studies, so she's prepared for the master's programs. Not that she needs all of them, but it's one of those things where it's like go above and beyond in your personal growth. Go above and beyond in the way you shape yourself. And so I think that's one of my other inspirations. So as long as you fill your life with people like that harness you and propel you, I think you get a trajectory of what you want. Um, and it's not to say that any one of these people specifically is the person that will get me to where I want to be, but I think in and of itself, having kind of that group pushes me forward.
Definitely. Those were fantastic answers. Jared, I want to thank you again for coming on the show today. Thank you so much. If you want to check out things that Jared does, you can always check out his Twitter at Jared Sartin, Sartin. Or check out his.
Also,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I also own the domain jared.sart.in. So you can check out, I think, all of my links there if you want to look at some of the code I've done. That's a great spot to be as well.
Yeah, good. I used that resource quite a bit when I was preparing for this show. Also, check out his D&D show. It sounds like a good time. Twitch.tv/HereBeDragons D&D. Twitch.tv HereBeDragons D&D. So check that out. I'm probably going to try to hover for an episode or two, see what's going on, even if I'm not the biggest D&D fan myself. And then, of course, I'll have all that information down in the description of the podcast. So if you don't want to type things out, you can always click those. But hey, if you like the Dev Dive stream, you can always watch live at twitch.tv/Nighthawk20000 or on YouTube, where we upload the VODs every Wednesday. So youtube.com/Nighthawk20000 as well. And if you can't catch it live and you don't want to watch the VOD, you can always listen on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple, every platform. Like we said, Anchor is excellent for that. So pretty much anything that you listen to podcasts on will be there. If you give us a follow and a rating on these platforms, helps out with SEO and discovery. Really appreciate that. And if you want to just hang out with me or anyone in my community, just join discord.gg/Nighthawk. We have a lot of fun people talking about stuff and exciting things. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you again, Jared, for coming on the show. Really appreciate you reaching out and being able to make this happen. So I'm looking forward to watching what happens in your life in the future. And we'll maybe in the future revisit Dev Dive episode 50 or 70 or wherever it ends up being. Jared Sartin V2. So thank you again for listening, guys, and have an excellent evening.